I think that the person who's listening to this new, revised and refreshed catalogue of Arts Florissants music, some of these things date from literally 30 years ago or more, should understand that everything they're hearing, be it Luigi Rossi or Charpentier or Lambert or whatever else, Handel, Monteverdi, this represents a personal choice. Everything that I do in my life, and I think that everything that we've done as an ensemble, essentially is a mirror of my own enjoyment, of my intense like of a particular piece or a particular composer. I've stayed very faithful to 2 centuries of music, the 17th and the 18th century, with an occasional infidelity towards the 19th century, because essentially this music talks to me, speaks to me, is the most attractive music for me, be it Italian or English or German or French, what have you. And I think that this sense of intense love, intense enjoyment that we get out of this repertory, that's what I want essentially to shine through, you see. I'm rather proud, and I don't say this in any smug way, of almost everything that we've recorded, because recording is a phenomenon in my life. To record is to allow something to live on. I love listening to Conchita Supervilla or Edi Norena, who recorded whatever they were doing in 1937 or whatever, because of that particular reason. Recording is a way of preserving something. And the things that I've recorded are the things I love the most, you see. Because I say to myself, yes, this is my love affair with Lambert, or this is my love affair with Luigi Rossi, and I want this to be what the people who are listening to me feel, you see. This intensely personal engagement that I have for this repertoire, or these repertories, you see. And this is, I suppose, why I'm so happy to have this new opportunity with Harmonia Mundi, but to essentially sort of reproduce and to redo and to bring out once again music that I've recorded perhaps the day before yesterday, but also the music that I've recorded 30 years ago. My career with the Harmonia Mundi company began in 1975 when I met Bernard Coutaz, and his idea was to, first of all, to have me as a harpsichord player, soloist, and that's how I began actually my recording career with Harmonia Mundi, with a series of recordings of harpsichord music. And then after that, he had a very good idea, Bernard, and this was to create a team of Baroque musicians. We, in a sense, were successors to the Alfred Deller consort. And it was very successful. He asked René Jacobs, very fine Baroque singer back then, Judith Nelson, singer, and the Kauken brothers from Belgium, as well as Konrad Jungheinl, the German lute player, and myself, to form a team, which was called Concerto Vocal. And that brought us into this rather extraordinary sort of repertory of chamber music, Baroque chamber music. And then in 1979, I announced to Bernard Coutaz that I was founding my own ensemble. He was a little bit weary of all this, wary rather. He turned to me and he said, you know, it's when I think early music is really something which is best done by foreigners, either the Dutch or the British or the Americans. I'm not quite sure. He said, I want to take a French ensemble. And I said, well, don't. But the fact is, if you don't, I'll sell it off to somebody else. And I did actually produce my own record, my own recording of a Charpentier oratorio, two actually, Saint Cecilia, Virgo and Martyr, and the Enfant prodigue. And he listened to it once I had essentially recorded it and said, yes, it's rather good. It's not bad at all. I'll take it. And so essentially I sold him the recording. In other words, we got in through the back door rather than the front door. And that was the beginning of a very successful, extremely successful number of years with the Harmonia Mundi company, with Bernard Coutaz and his wife Eva, and myself in the Arts Florissants. At the beginning, the very beginning of the creation of my ensemble, we had a very unfortunate name, which essentially was suggested to us by some elected people from the Ile-de-France who were giving us a bit of money. And it was going to be called the Ensemble Baroque et Vocal Baroque de l'Ile-de-France, which was not a very happy choice of a name. And one day I was having a rehearsal with my singers and my instrumental players, and we were actually rehearsing a piece called Les Arts Florissants, which is a marvelous little mini opera of Marc-Antoine Charpentier. And one of our singers, Michel Laplainie, his name is, at one point during the rehearsal closed his book and started to mutter, Les Arts Florissants, Les Arts Florissants, Les Arts Flo, oui. Ben voilà, j'ai trouvé le nom, I found the name. We're not going to be called that awful name with too many syllables and too many words. We're going to be simply called Les Arts Florissants. And since everybody loves abbreviations in France, it'll become Les Arts Flo. And it stuck. Composers, like writers, like painters, like sculptors, live moments of glory, and then live moments of less glory, sort of simply just being forgotten. It's not hard to sort of remind people today that Bach was forgotten after his death. Very few composers actually can sort of withstand the ravages of taste and musical change. Most composers have been rediscovered. That's to say, those composers who have lived, 400 or 300 or 200 years ago. And then they're rediscovered for reasons simply because, yes, their music is grand and great. If Bach had to be rediscovered, well, someone who's perhaps not as grand as Bach, like Marc-Antoine Charpentier, had even worse sort, you see. And the French, let's face it, are notoriously dependent on what they call la mode. Musical taste changes. Let's face it, I mean, Bach did not write the way that Beethoven did, and Beethoven did not write the way that Wagner did. And it seems that every generation discovers something better and new, you see. It's perfectly obvious to me that, yes, he had to sort of have Marc-Antoine Charpentier had to sort of have a moment of dormancy where he simply was forgotten by everybody, and then a rediscovery. We've been part of this process. I didn't rediscover Marc-Antoine Charpentier, but I certainly have contributed, along with my ensemble, to making him into, once again, a great composer of the French Baroque. Charpentier is an original composer and a unique composer when he's compared to his contemporaries in France. he arrives essentially as a mature young composer from Italy. And he could write in the Italian style, which is very different than the French style. However, he was French and lived in Paris, and so he essentially, during the course of his lifetime, learned to be both French and Italian. His originality is the fact that he's a little bit better than almost everybody he was compared to. If I today can have a good, long, and hard look as a musicologist and as a performing musician at the sort of the totality of French music making of the end of the 17th century, that includes people like Lully, Deslandes, and Charpentier, of course. I'd say that hands down, Charpentier is the best composer. He's certainly the person who had the most under his belt in terms of musical experience. He wasn't by any means the most important or the most popular back then. That was Lully. The question that you've asked me is, why is his theater music underestimated, and is it important? Yes, it's very important, but the fact is he couldn't do it because there was a monopoly on essentially staged music for the theater, or if you will, opera. And this monopoly was held by Lully, Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was a very important man, a very important composer, in terms of the synthesis of ideas, perhaps even more important than Charpentier. But he was a ruthless man. He was an unpleasant man. And he was the king's favorite. And because he was in favor with the king, he was able to engineer a title. He became the surintendant de la musique. And he had control essentially over everything that had to do with music on stage, which meant that no one else could write the way he could, you see. So essentially, Charpentier lived most of his life as a very, very good composer of church music, of sacred music. That didn't, however, prevent him from being immensely talented as a writer for the stage. Molière knew that, because when after Molière had a row with Lully, Molière turns to Charpentier, and it's Charpentier who writes for the theater in a limited way because of the restrictions imposed by Lully. Lully dies in 1687, and it gives not only Charpentier but other composers the chance to shine, free from these tyrannical sort of restraints imposed by Lully. And it's that moment where he increases his production of essentially secular music and writes at the end of the century probably what is the most brilliant and the most moving, I think, of all of the great tragédies lyriques, which is Médée. At the beginning of my career with the Arts Florissants, we sort of published a manifesto. What do we want to do? What are our objectives? What are our aims? And why are we and how are we different from other ensembles? And I think this is a very important thing to talk about, because essentially this definition of an aim we've kept alive now since 1979. The idea was that we would champion French music. We would champion the underdog, let's say the people who had been forgotten, like Charpentier, or like Michel Lambert, or the Moulinier brothers. And we would also put into question the way people were playing music that was better known. It could be Lully, it could be Monteverdi, it could be, and these were important considerations. I chose the Étienne Moulinier. There are two There's Antoine and Etienne, two brothers, because their music is of an enormously high quality, and it was completely and utterly unknown. So much unknown that I would spend time with my colleagues like Dominique Wyss and others at the Bibliothèque Nationale, transcribing this music, which essentially hadn't been performed or sung, played for 300 years. I had been looking at Moulinier, the air de cour, the polyphonic air de cour, as well as his extraordinary religious music for a number of years. And I said to myself, fine, amongst the earliest recordings, the first recordings that I want to do with my ensemble, the Arts Florissants, we're going to do Moulinier. And indeed we did. Who are they? Honest, brilliant composers. They worked essentially for the brother of Louis XIII, that's to say the father of Le Roi Soleil. This fellow was called Gaston d'Orléans, and he was, of all the Bourbons, along with his brother the king, certainly the most musical of the royal family. Had a very good establishment, musical establishment in Blois, and the Moulinier brothers worked for him for a number of years. It was a fascinating moment, actually, in French history, because the wars of religion were still coming, but they were still present, they're coming to an end. He could write brilliantly in both French and in Latin. It was also a very interesting musical period for me, because again, it was totally unknown. Not only the composers like Moulinier or Boesset or Guédon, but the entire period, culturally speaking, of Louis XIII was something which was, very much eclipsed by what was happening afterwards with the court of Louis XIV. Well, you don't have to be in a church to sing religious music, obviously. The best and the most important religious music was conceived as to be sung in a religious environment, that's to say a church, a cathedral, a basilica, a convent, a monastery. But there's other music as well. I mean, house music, as the Germans call it, devotional music that could be sung by a family or could be sung by a small group of people in a non-religious, non-liturgical context was obviously very present from essentially from the time that Christianity was born, 2,000 years ago. You have devotional music that can be sung in the household, as was this, or amongst a small group of amateurs, or a group of professionals, but singing perhaps for their own enjoyment. One forgets as well that this music was published, which means it was bought to be sung not only by professionals, but by amateurs. The impact, the importance of published music can't be overestimated. It's very important. And this music is a great deal of music of the 17th century and the 18th century was designed to be bought and sung, not by professionals, but by amateurs. Early music, obviously, music before the end of the 18th century, oftentimes has to be deciphered and treated in a different way than a score, let's say, of Tchaikovsky or Massenet or Rossini. The Moulinier in question was published first in separate parts. In other words, you don't have a complete score. And when I was interested in this, I suddenly discovered, to my great disappointment, that one of the 5 parts was missing. It had probably been stolen from the Bibliothèque Nationale during the war. God knows how or why. But by an enormous stroke of good luck, we found this particular collection of pieces in the King's Library, transcribed many, many years afterwards, at the end of the 17th century, by Philidor, the king's musician, his librarian, where all of the parts were present, which allowed us essentially to make a new edition. In other words, there was no edition that one could buy, and there was no edition that we could simply even get from the library that was complete, you see. So there was essentially the first task was to actually create the score. After that, it's a question of many things. Was it accompanied? Is there a basse continue? Was it sung a cappella? How many singers were singing this? Was it a single voice on a part? What kind of French does one use, you know? Does this music need to be ornamented? Does it need to have essentially something done to it, such to make it come alive, other than just singing it off the page? Yes. So this was a kind of a detective story in many ways. It's very simple to go to a musical text, which essentially talks about musical history. And one reads, of course, that French music was going through an enormous transformation in the middle part of the 17th century. Transformed by whom and how? Well, essentially, it wasn't the French that was doing it; it was the Italians who were coming into France. France had far fewer border restrictions than we do today, or that were existent in the 19th century. France essentially opened itself up to Spanish influence, to Italian influence, to influence coming from the north, from Flanders, and what have you. French musicians were essentially lagging behind what we could call now sort of major musical developments. But from the end of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Baroque, to essentially the great Baroque era, which announces itself at the end of the 17th century. They were lagging behind the Italians. It was only natural that a French musician in 1640 or 1650, whatever, would take as a model, or at least acknowledge as a model, the new developments in Italian style. And more than that, let's face it, I mean, Italy was contributing not only to culture, but to politics. One shouldn't forget that Mazarin is not French. One shouldn't forget that the two Medici ladies were, yes, for many years, some of the most important and powerful sort of cultural influences in France. This meant that there was an enormous number of Italians doing all kinds of things, rearranging the eating habits of the French, introducing new fashion, but also introducing new music. And amongst the most important of these people, of course, was Luigi Rossi, along with someone like Francesco Cavalli, to mention just two of the really great sort of people. They were brought to Paris. They were brought to Paris essentially by hommes politiques, by important counselors of the state, and they were essentially there to influence and impress. Louis XIV knew both of them very well indeed, because essentially they were bringing to France the most important musical creation of the 17th century, which is opera. These pieces of Luigi Rossi, it's not opera. They're small religious pieces which come out of the Barberini collection in Rome. But were they sung, and was this style known in France? Very much so, very much so. The influence of Italian opera in the 17th century milieu of Paris and France cannot be overestimated. It was immensely important. Lully, who is considered to be the father, along with Louis XIV, of the greatest stage style that France has ever produced, which is the La Tragédie lyrique. Lully essentially could do it only because he was Italian himself. And did he know Cavalli and Rossi? He sure did, intimately well, as he knew Monteverdi. And it was this knowledge, along with his new knowledge of the French theatre, which forged this enormously important national operatic style, which we call the tragédie lyrique. I don't come back to a composer. I simply just continue living with a composer. I find it's very curious. You know, someone will ask me, "Well, why did you record the Charpentier's Médée twice? Or why do you want to do another Messiah? Or why do you want to do this?" And my reply is very simple. I mean, I know a number of pianists who re-record the Beethoven sonatas. Or why does Leonhardt, for example, a number of years ago, record 2 or 3 times the Goldbergs? First of all, it's music that one lives with. It's music that one grows up with, and it's music that might differ in terms of the interpretation one would give it. Yes. And since it's very strong music, and music that one loves, it can benefit perhaps from another reading, another go at it. I discovered Lambert, as I said, Lambert came into my life when I was a student at Yale many, many years ago. And I was absolutely enthralled with the exquisiteness of someone who, a bit like Chopin, limits himself to a particular form, but does it in the most exquisite way. His only interest really is in this immensely sophisticated air for solo voice or for a small group of voices. He lives a long life. He evolves immensely himself. At the end of his long life, in 1689, he publishes an anthology of the things that his work that he considered to be the most important. And 25 years ago, I started recording this music, but I didn't get through it all. I didn't have to. It was a single long play record, an LP, and it's been part of my repertoire ever since. There's not a year that goes by that I don't do a small concert with a few singers, and then I don't do the music of Michel Lambert. Over the last several years, I've had the opportunity to be in the company of some marvelous young singers. And I said to myself, fine, we'll do another recording, another period of intense work around Michel Lambert, using some of the pieces that I recorded 20-some years ago, but also doing the new stuff, the stuff that hadn't been recorded. Is there enough for a 3rd recording? Yes. There might be enough for a 4th recording, or a 5th recording. he's a composer who doesn't let you down. As I said, the quality is extraordinarily high. He arrives, like a number of composers that I love, at the end of something. You can't really do any better than this generation, this last generation of composers. He's not alone. He shares the honors with people like Le Camus or Dambry or Labarre. But it's one of the really most French, the quintessentially French styles of music. This intimate air. It would remind, I suppose, people who don't know anything about Baroque music of the grand moments of Chausson or of Fauré. The solo song on extremely good texts. So it becomes not only a musical sort of vehicle, but as well it becomes a literary sort of thing as well. It's very much akin to the French art song of the end of the 19th, early 20th century. We have ways now, essentially, of nurturing and inspiring and encouraging young singers and instrumental players. The Jardin des Voix is every 2-year vocal competition. We audition maybe 200, 230, 250 voices all over the world. And 6, 7, sometimes 8 singers are chosen. And the idea is that these voices, these personalities, these singing personalities, are then put together to form an ensemble. Why an ensemble? Because I love ensemble music, and especially vocal ensemble music. But it's also a way that we can explore repertory. But the ultimate aim is to essentially help singers who we believe in and who we find extremely good to begin their careers. In other words, we take singers who are in their 20s, who have just finished musical school, conservatory, and who are in that very critical part of their career, that's to say the very beginning of the career. My notoriety, the notoriety of the reputation of the Arts Florissants is such that we can sell these singers sight unheard or unseen to the best halls in the world. So they go off to Wigmore Hall, they go off to the Barbican, they go off to Lincoln Center, they go off to the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam or the Musikverein in Vienna, the Philharmonie in Paris or the Cité de la Musique, the Auditorio in Madrid, and almost every other good hall in the world. And they have a chance to be heard. What's interesting for me, of course, is too that I choose voices, I don't choose repertory. In other words, I wasn't choosing the last group of youngsters just because I wanted them to sing Lambert or I wanted them to sing Purcell or what have you. But it just happens that these people can be very good at these things, you see. So, of course, some of the singers are now part of this recording project for a project which is called Air Sérieux, Air Boire. This is a literary as well as a musical phenomenon, very much like the French art song of the end of the 19th century. Who were writing? Well, you're having people like Jean de La Fontaine or Isaac de Montserrat, the greatest versifiers probably of their era. And they're the ones who are giving us the texts, either for the Air Sérieux or for the Air qui n'est pas sérieux du tout, for that's to say, the drinking song. Cantatas essentially belong to everybody who wants to make some music. Again, you cannot overestimate the importance of printing, the importance of music that can be sold in a shop and bought by anybody. The French cantata, like the Italian cantata, is a piece that can be technically difficult or not technically difficult, but can be sung by one voice or perhaps two voices with a minimal accompaniment. In other words, one doesn't need a choir, one doesn't need an orchestra, one doesn't need a vast group of people to make very good music. So it appeals essentially to you, me, the singer who might be an amateur singer, as well as the professionals. Since it's a new phenomenon, since it comes ultimately from Italy, this caught on. It started, the fashion for the cantata starts in the early part of the 18th century and goes way up into the 1750s and 60s. It's very important. Well, it's not true, actually, that we don't have sufficient biographical information of Michel Pignolet de Monteclair. He was an honnête musicien. He was a hard-working Parisian musician who played, wrote, taught. He wrote music, but he also wrote a very good theoretical treatise, which I use because essentially it tells people who need to know about musical details, especially performance practice, what to do. So essentially he's important still today for us because he can explain how to do something. You mentioned that Rameau held him in esteem. Yes, he's a very good composer. He wrote some very good opera, and he also wrote some extremely good cantatas, as well as some very good instrumental music. One can follow his career. There are no real problems in terms of his biographical data. He's part of a generation that is less well considered because of where they fall chronologically. Comportera, Monteclair, Mondonville, and you could add to those three an enormous list of others, happened to fall between the death of Lully and the beginnings of the career, the big career, the operatic career of Jean-Philippe Rameau. In other words, we're talking about essentially the end of the 17th century up until 1730, 1733. It's a long period in musical history. To consider it to be an arid, uneventful moment is to be very wrong indeed. Comportera, comme Mondonville, comme Monteclair, these are composers who are very important. And again, when we first started out with the Arts Florissants, our idea was to put people back into their proper importance, which meant that very early on, we started working on Comportera. We started working on Mondonville, and we did a lot of work with Monteclair. I recorded the Jephte, which is a brilliant piece, a piece that should be put back on stage. It's certainly one of the great biblical operas, as good as the Jephte oratorio of Handel, certainly. certainly as good as the Carissimi, far more sort of involved, very ambitious when it comes to orchestration and vocal writing. Rameau was dead right in liking it, because it prefigures a number of things that he was preoccupied with, namely colorful orchestration, interesting harmonic effects, very subtle use of chorus and orchestra. And he's someone who is far more known today than he was in 1981 or 82 or 83. But there's still much to be done. It comes out of a collection assembled for the Barberini family, where most of the pieces in question could be attributed, and some really are, to Luigi Rossi. But that's the work, you see, of a good musicologist. Are there still the same problems in terms of attribution that one has in terms of painting? Yes. But with good scholarship, attributions sometimes become more apparent. The Oratorio per la Settimana Santa is a piece that was written for Holy Week, for O cecità, which is the old blindness of human, and Il peccator pentito, the penitent sinner. They belong to essentially a repertory of religious music which is non-liturgical, non-biblical, and what have you. The texts are highly sort of literary, and the theology, especially of the Oratorio per la Settimana Santa, is something that would simply be impossible in today's, in contemporary sort of theology or contemporary sort of churchmanship. Why? Because this obsession, which begins in the Italian Renaissance with classical, mythological, Greco-Roman mythology, mixed up with Orthodox Christianity, is very much the taste of the time. We have the Virgin Mary going down to a classical Hades, and encountering essentially people who were not part of the Christian world at all, but part of very much, of essentially a classical mythological world. It's a highly colored, extremely personal sort of document. The kind of text that was written by a Roman cardinal or even a Roman pope, but involving essentially this immensely sort of humanistic and classically oriented sort of education. It's a very good piece. It's a brilliant piece. Rameau, in terms of what he's contributing that's new and exciting, he's a bit like Bach and Handel. Is he really an innovator, or is he someone just bringing to his works a brilliance that hadn't existed before, but essentially not changing essential structure? What does he have that people don't, that others don't have? Well, if you take a look at the ballet, Nele Myrtis and Pygmalion are two ballets, two one-act ballets. We're essentially talking about a form that existed before, but perhaps not as brilliantly conceived as is the case with Rameau. His harmonic language is new. He's invented it. You hear a piece of Rameau and you say to yourself, there can't be anybody else but Rameau, because of the extreme brilliance of the harmonic writing. He brings as well to a form that was known, an extraordinary brilliance in terms of orchestral texture and writing as well. None of his contemporaries, or none of his immediate predecessors, like Comportera or Montville, Monteclair, have the audacity or have this extraordinary richness that he brings to the orchestra. And then you add as well to that perhaps a sense of rhythm, an extraordinary sense of rhythm that I find perhaps more as exciting as anything that Stravinsky could have written 200 years later. And it was obviously just as new sounding in 1750 or 1745 as Stravinsky was in 1910 or 1915.